Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar on deliverability. My name is Faith Albers, and I am the Director of Client Marketing here at WearAware. Just to get a few housekeeping items out of the way, we are recording this, and we will send the recording, the webinar slides, and a checklist about deliverability out after the webinar in an email either today or tomorrow. If you're on Twitter, feel free to tweet along with us with the hashtag WowWebinar. And lastly, if you have any questions, feel free to chat them to us in the little chat box, and hopefully we'll have time to get to a few after the webinar. So a little bit about WearAware. We are a digital marketing agency located in the Washington, D.C. area. We provide an array of digital marketing services from design and development to strategic consulting. My team specializes in leveraging data from multiple systems to create highly targeted, personalized, and automated marketing campaigns. So today we'll be talking through one of the case studies that we did with one of our customers, Cuisinart, and we'll dive a little bit into the exact steps that we took to write their deliverability scenario. So let's start out by defining deliverability. Email deliverability is the ability to deliver emails to subscriber inboxes. Marketers use the deliverability rate and results to gauge the likelihood of their email campaigns reaching their subscribers' inboxes. This can vary, and in a lot of cases, the deliverability rate is provided by your email send provider, but that's something that you can monitor on your own as well. So in a recent deliverability benchmark report done by ReturnPath, roughly 15% of emails don't reach their intended audience. So this actually went down from the 2017 report, which was, I believe, about 20%. So it is getting a little bit better, but still definitely a reoccurring issue and something that marketers do need to pay attention to. A couple of factors that are related to deliverability are maintaining a positive IP and domain reputation. This tells internet service providers or ISPs and inbox providers like Gmail and Outlook that you're a legitimate sender and that you're complying with the rules for high volume email marketing. It also is related to database health. So in order to follow those rules, you need to only send to contacts you have permission to send to. In order to do that, you have to practice good data hygiene and follow best practices for opting in contacts. And finally, not to be overlooked, your email content. So bad email content, especially including templates, subject lines, that sort of thing, can land you in a spam folder or even trigger abuse reports. So these are a couple of elements that can hurt deliverability. In a lot of cases, you could have a poor deliverability score just because of one or two of these items. In some cases, it's all of them, but definitely areas that you would want to check into. So first off, sending without custom authentication. So you want to make sure that you've verified your SPF and DKIM records. Using single opt-in as opposed to double opt-in, primarily because you may continue to send to unverified email addresses if you only use a single opt-in. Sending from a free domain email address, so looking at sending from a Gmail address or other free domains that are out there, Yahoo, ultimately that can kind of trigger a no-no in the deliverability world. Making it difficult to unsubscribe, which may cause recipients to flag you as spam or abuse. Using URL shorteners, which can be seen as deceptive in the inbox. Ultimately, using things like a bit.ly link can be a little bit deceptive to some ISPs, and they won't accept that as legitimate, so be cautious about that. And then sending emails with too many images that aren't coded correctly, or ultimately having a template that is not performing well. All of those pieces combined can cause challenges. So looking a little bit into Cuisinart's challenges. So they came to us with some struggles regarding deliverability and ultimately requested our assistance with helping them improve their deliverability scores and helping them get into the inbox. So just a little bit about Cuisinart. I'm sure many of you have heard of them. So they're a market leader in high-end kitchen products and housewares, including outdoor grilling. Their products enable consumers to quickly and easily provide their family with home-cooked foods, from a cup of coffee to an extravagant holiday meal. They are a division of Conair, and ultimately, I'm sure you've seen them in a lot of common retailers and high-end specialty stores. So our main goal here was to work with this customer and identify some of their challenges, and then moving forward, deliver some solutions to get them out of the bad place that they were in regarding deliverability. So when Cuisinart came to us, they had previously been sending monthly promotional emails to their entire database at very large volumes, so millions of emails at a time, essentially. Around May of 2018, their deliverability from marketing emails took a pretty steep drop, and during a Mother's Day campaign, their deliverability rate went all the way down to 15% due to mail blocks and bounces, and their IP address was blacklisted. At that time, Cuisinart paused all email marketing activities and sought a deliverability solution. Ultimately, only delivering 15% is not sustainable and not a good use of marketing budget and resources. So they did decide to move away from their email marketing platform they were using at the time and decided to transition to IBM Watson Campaign Automation for a completely fresh start. So we're going to take a look at the phased approach that we took for getting Cuisinart's deliverability back to an acceptable place. So the first step in this fresh start was to analyze and assess the current situation. We needed to figure out the root cause of their deliverability problems in order to find a solution. As is usually the case with deliverability, the issues that led to our client's deliverability challenge were multifaceted. So we're going to dive into some of the things that we found that were causing those deliverability issues. So we started by conducting an in-depth look into all aspects of their current email marketing. This holistic approach is typically preferred since it's usually not one big issue that tanks deliverability. We need to look at everything. During this phase, where we're audited the email templates, their database structure, and we reviewed the performance metrics in their previous ESP, and conducted rigorous diagnostic testing to analyze their domain reputation. Ultimately, starting out, you have to do a lot of research, a lot of background work to identify what the causes of the issues are. So we pulled performance reports for all of their marketing and transactional emails sent and examined the code and content for those emails. We were looking for any elements of their email sending practices that could have triggered spam filters and abuse reports. So in terms of this evaluation, we sent live tests of all of their email templates at the time to 90+ applications, devices, and platforms where we conducted spam and deliverability testing. We analyzed the email template code and rendering to see how those emails appeared in the inbox. And as part of that template review, we also examined copy, design, and layout, and identified opportunities to improve engagement within the email with better calls to action and clearer value propositions. We then took all that information, measured the performance of the test based on email marketing best practices and benchmarks, and essentially kind of provided a report card of where the major issues were and how we could potentially resolve those. So beyond analyzing the email code and content, we took a deep dive into their marketing database. Poor deliverability is largely due to hard and soft bounces, especially in those cases. Basically, those bounces are a rejection note from the recipient's inbox. Typically, when we see a high amount of bounces, this means your database is in need of a cleanup. If you acquired an email address 10 years ago, let's say, there's a good chance it's no longer relevant, especially if the recipient hasn't engaged with your emails recently. We see this with a lot of customers who have a lot of old or dated email addresses, essentially, and this is a pretty common issue. So if that's something that you have, don't feel like you're alone. Furthermore, poorly maintained data that's not regularly cleaned, which cleaning would be removing inactive subscribers, validating the formatting of those email addresses, deduping, etc., as well as improper data collection methods can cause issues as well. So some of those improper data collection methods, again, can vary by industry and by company, but some no-nos or areas that we see issues with some of our customers is when using purchase lists, using event or conference list where there wasn't an explicit opt-in, and not appropriately setting expectations for what subscribers will receive. We kind of look at that as, blasting an email to your entire database. In most scenarios, that's not going to be a good sending practice for optimal database health. One unseen and sometimes overlooked aspect of email marketing is IP and domain reputation. So your template can be great, but sending from an unverified domain and unwarmed IP can cause big issues getting to the inbox. For some marketers, this is a daunting task. I know, I've been there. It sounds a little more complicated than it is, though. But typically, this is something that's done when you're onboarding onto a new ESP or if you're adding a new sending domain. So there's a couple of different scenarios where you start this, but it's never too late to revisit it. So some things you should look for to see if you have a deliverability problem is checking if your hard bounces and soft bounces are over 2% of your total send list. Additionally, check if your abuse rate is higher than the benchmark average for your industry. That return path benchmark report I mentioned previously is a great asset to get those numbers. They have information on industry averages as well as location-based averages to really provide yourself with a standard of what is good and what is bad. So you should also do a spam and inbox placement test. We highly recommend using a tool like Litmus for this. If you don't have Litmus, you can do this manually by setting up test email accounts in various platforms and sending to them to see if they got into the inbox. But that isn't a perfect method. Ultimately, that's just the exact same as someone in your company sending you an email saying, hey, this went into my spam. It's just a little bit more of a formal process to review that on a lot of different scenarios to see if that's, you know, a case-by-case basis or if that's something that's happening at a wider scale. Additionally, look up your domain and IP reputation online. There are various reputation scales out there like Sender Score from Return Path, Barracuda, Trusted Source from McAfee. So there's a lot of different ways that you can look into that reputation. A quick Google search will get you some of those tools pretty easily, and some of them are free just to see the score. And then after that, you can identify where do we go from here, what is our next step. So the second step that, you know, once we've identified the issue, we want to improve the data and send health. So as we were starting from scratch, we requested a fresh sending IP address from our ESP. So a dedicated IP address, not a shared one just for our client. Sometimes ESPs will give you an option to use a dedicated rather than a shared IP. So shared IP essentially means that you share the risk of someone else hurting your deliverability score. Most DSPs have strict rules to prevent poor sending practices when using a shared IP, but it's good to know the difference, as sometimes with that shared IP, the average deliverability for that IP actually might be lower overall than if you had a dedicated one because you can control 100% of the emails that are basically sending from that IP. We also requested a new sending domain and worked with our ESP support team to get all of the appropriate DKIM, SPF, and DMARC records in place. We created a new database structure that would accommodate data from multiple systems and allow us to keep a tight control on double opt-in data, email content, and frequency preferences. Our next step was to warm the brand new IP with our new template, starting by sending to the most engaged contacts first, then gradually increasing our send volumes, and in time, trying to re-engage those inactive contacts. We did implement a double opt-in email sign-up form, which is a best practice for optimal deliverability. This ensures that we're only sending to legitimate email addresses. It requires them to confirm via a link that is sent to them via an email that they do want to receive the emails. And another kind of added plus to this is essentially the first email that you send to someone, you want them to open it, and ideally you want them to click in it. You know, inboxes like Gmail will basically take a look and see, hey, are people engaging with your content? And a double opt-in is a really, really great way to require essentially that initial engagement that shows that, yes, I am a real person on this end, receiving this email, clicking this button, and this is okay to continue sending emails to me. With the influx of GDPR, CASL compliance, and even new regulation in California, more US companies are moving towards double opt-in databases. It's definitely not required for good deliverability, and we do have plenty of customers who do have single opt-in databases, you know, especially US-only companies. Again, it's not necessarily required to have double opt-in, but it's definitely something to consider, especially if you're having issues. We also implemented an email preference center and made sure to rigorously honor the email preferences that our customers have set using queries when sending our one-off emails or promotional emails on an ongoing basis. It's important to honor those preferences so that your contacts aren't only receiving emails that they want and aren't getting annoyed by them and hitting spam or abuse. You know, we would much rather someone just unsubscribe rather than hitting spam or flagging your email as abuse. So if you want to improve deliverability, you really have to embrace the unsubscribe. We have some customers who, not necessarily want to make unsubscribing harder, but aren't necessarily going to push that into a customer's inbox easily to say, yes, please unsubscribe me. But ultimately, if you want to clean up your data and have those best practices in place, we strongly recommend that you embrace that unsubscribe. Again, that's going to be much better off in the long run rather than having someone flag you as abuse, or rather just go completely dormant and then you're wasting your sends on someone who's not active either. Now that we had a fresh IP setup, we wanted to make sure we imported clean, valid data into our marketing database. So we used a third-party data cleansing tool as well as some proprietary algorithms to validate email address formatting, to identify email addresses that were spam traps, also identify the email addresses that had hard bounces and were inactive. So we were really careful to understand that if we were importing inactive folks into our database, that we knew exactly who they were and segmented them appropriately so they can be easily removed from send lists. So just because you've got inactive folks doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to put them in your main database, but you should definitely know where they are, be able to flag them in one way or another, whether that's in a contact list and a separate query based off of a flagged field. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but definitely just knowing who those people are and cleaning that data and appending to that data in some cases based off of where that source is. The more information that you're able to provide within that marketing database, whoever is creating the queries for your one-off mailings is going to be in a lot better spot to make some educated decisions about who to send to. So based on the results of the data cleansing process, we ranked all of the contacts that were in the marketing database into tiers. This would later help us identify the audiences we should use in IP warming. So we only imported valid email addresses and segmented those contacts by their tiered engagement level. So as you can see in this list, we had 6 different tiers, and tier 1, which is arguably the best portion of our database, those are the people who opened and clicked within the last 180 days. Again, we were pulling this data from their previous ESP. And ultimately, you can see that only 0.5% of the entire database had opened and clicked within the last 180 days. So understanding that there's a lot of contacts that ultimately were dormant or inactive. You can see that kind of as we go up here, so tier 2 has opened in the last 180 days with no clicks. So, they've opened but haven't necessarily engaged. Tier 3, they've opened an email over 180 days ago. Tier 4 has never opened an email. Tier 5, hard bounces, abuse complaints, spam complaints, or unsubscribed. And then tier 6 being an invalid email format. So that would be contacts that didn't have an @ symbol or a period, basically, where the domain would be identified. So in a lot of those cases too, this is again kind of standards for basic database cleansing, but going a level further to truly identify who those people were. A lot of people are surprised that such a large percentage of the database had never opened an email. That can be for a variety of reasons, but right there is a huge red flag that if you're sending to, 78, if you send to the entire list, 78% of those people have never opened an email. And ultimately, ISPs see that. They understand, hey, these people aren't really engaged and maybe you are spamming them. So that's a definite way to take a look into what's the best case scenario moving forward. Who should I be emailing to show these ISPs that we are real? So we took a look at all of the data sources that we're feeding into the marketing database and made sure to standardize field names and the import processes. We automated processes and simplified the data flow, which reduced manual work, which is another really good safeguard, because the last thing you want is having a new employee unknowingly importing a list of bad contacts into your database without a structured process to catch that error. So anything you can automate is typically going to be better because you have a lot of control in terms of exactly who's coming in. We also consolidated their database, which allows for segmentation for personalized one-to-one communications and really a better picture of those customers. So if you're using multiple databases that don't talk to each other, this is a lot more challenging rather than having kind of a single database where all that information is stored. A lot of ESPs will have relational tables or other databases, other queries or areas where data is segmented, but as much as you can, trying to have that single source of truth will help your data be a lot cleaner. Also, really be cautious if you're using multiple ESPs. There's a lot of people that we've heard of who are, currently migrating from one tool to another, and in the interim they're sending from both tools. Be really, really careful there. Again, you want to have that single source of data, especially as it relates to those bounces. You want to make sure that if someone's been added to one suppression list, they've been added to the other. And ultimately, our main recommendation is moving just to using one ESP overall for sending your emails, just to make sure that you have 100% administrative control over that data. So our IP warm-up plan was to start sending to those tier 1 folks who opened or clicked an email in the last 180 days. So starting with the most engaged customers shows ISPs that you're one of the good guys and that your customers like hearing from you. Think about it kind of like a credit card. Starting off with 0 credit, if you're brand new, essentially, you need to build your credit before you're eligible to get a high score. So it can take time, and it makes sense to start with small, good decisions and gradually build with riskier moves that are calculated. Over time, we gradually sent to more people, but made sure to suppress the invalid email addresses and most of the inactive folks initially. IP warming did coincide with a new site launch for Cuisinart, so it was a great message to re-engage contacts who had not heard from our client in a while. After 90 days of consistent sending and establishing good deliverability with our tier 1 and eventually our tier 2 contacts, we began to engage tier 3 and 4 contacts. We split tier 4 into 2 different groups: explicit and implicit consent. Again, that was that really, really large group of people, kind of the majority of the database. So explicit consent, meaning we knew they intentionally opted in at some point based off of data that we had regarding their record in the marketing database. And then the second group of implicit consent. So we weren't sure if they had asked to be on the list or intentionally opted in, so we sent them an email and asked them to opt in. At a certain point, if they didn't opt in, we stopped sending to them. So as you can see here, we used a dynamic content banner to show either an opt-in or an email preferences call to action based off of these 2 groups. So for, like I said, I think it was about 90 days that we used this banner, tried to provide those contacts with that opportunity to opt in before we were just not going to send to them anymore. So gave them a couple chances to become engaged. This did happen to coincide with Black Friday and Cyber Monday, so we did go back to our IP warming methodology of carefully and manually controlling the hourly and daily send volumes to gradually ramp up to the eventual 2 million contacts that they had in their database. So ultimately, it's something also make sure you're aware of the seasonality of things. I would say there's probably better times to do IP warming than others, but ultimately identifying when people are the most likely to be engaged is the best time to do this. So this process was definitely a labor of love, but it paid off. So Cuisinart's deliverability went from 83% to 99%. Ultimately, their database size did shrink, but it was for the best. So again, sometimes people are hesitant to remove inactive subscribers from their mailing list, and we hear that a lot. Those email addresses are considered an asset and something that shouldn't just be thrown away. But ultimately, keeping those contacts in your standard send list only hurts the bigger group in the long run. Additionally, consider why you would want to send to someone who doesn't want to hear from you. Even if they want to engage on other channels, you may be sending a bad company brand message by ignoring their behavior or lack thereof if they're not opening your emails. So focus instead on nurturing the relationship of your engaged audience and building your database through quality lead generation efforts. And if you have to answer to people internally who are saying, hey, we can't just not send to these people, use the data to say these people aren't opening anyway, and ultimately it is hurting us in the long run. So try and show them some of those statistics to prove your point. So the final step here is to maintain the data and deliverability health. So once you've gotten to a good spot, you need to make sure that you're continuing on. Just because you have good deliverability right now doesn't mean that's going to be a forever thing. So you need to make sure that you're maintaining it. So deliverability and data maintenance is an ongoing effort and should be approached from multiple angles. So make sure you're utilizing a mobile responsive email template and implementing easy to use opt-in and unsubscribe forms. So kind of that step one there of making sure that we've got the right bones to go forward in terms of the content that we're using. Providing fresh, engaging content also helps to ensure a positive customer experience, which will reduce abuse complaints and help improve overall reputation. Sometimes the way that I like to look at this is if I receive this email in my inbox, would I think it was spam? Would I be annoyed by it? Is this helpful to my customer, or am I just trying to get them to come buy something or convert in more of an annoying or spammy sort of way? So you can kind of do your own litmus test there of, is this relevant, is this engaging, and is it ultimately achieving my marketing goals? Also make sure that you're monitoring your deliverability metrics, your deliverability rate, how many hard and soft bounces you have per mailing, and abuse rates. Ultimately, by monitoring those, and sometimes you can set up a monitoring system essentially to alert you if there's an issue with those mailing lists. Because like I said, just because you have great deliverability to start doesn't mean it's going to be the case forever. So as part of the ongoing maintenance of deliverability, we made sure that Cuisinart updated their master email template. So this was done, prior to IP warming to make sure that we were starting with a clean start. But again, there's definitely those scenarios where, 6 months down the road, a year down the road, you want to make sure that you're maintaining those practices. So we completed a detailed assessment of their current template, identifying issues for resolution, and worked to create mock-ups that aligned with Cuisinart's desired branding. We then coded the email template and uploaded it to the marketing automation tool for future use to make sure that every email we're sending out was on brand and using the exact same template, making sure that it's all using the same opt-out form, that the email preferences form was linked to correctly, and that ultimately we are making sure that we've kind of crossed our T's and dotted our I's there. The master template is made of building blocks that we call modules that can be pieced together to build individual mailing templates. So when we create these master templates, they essentially are extremely long and have these individual modules for different sections. You can see one example here, this stackable image gallery. These are essentially different drag and drop type modules that we can have in the template so that it doesn't have to look exactly the same every single time you send out a mailing, but it provides you consistency, and especially something that a customer is used to. If you switch up your branding and your template a lot, the customer, if there's pros and cons to it, and there are different industry standards on that, I think, as well. But ultimately, you want that consistent brand image so that the customer recognizes you as well and is, open to engaging with that email. So ultimately, we also want to make sure that we're staying in line with our email design best practices, such as having clickable buttons and calls to action, and having a good balance of white space, copy, and imagery. Again, this is especially important when you've got a bunch of different people within your organization handling email marketing. If it's just you, you know exactly what you're doing, you know exactly what you need to use going forward. But having a main template is really, really good, especially when you've got a lot of different people involved, to make sure that you're having that consistency and you have those processes going forward for everyone. A couple of the other modules that we've created within that email template, they've got flexible S-curves that provide the opportunity for the eye to kind of gaze through the email. We find these really, really popular in email. Also, we have an interactive video content module. Essentially, we're also continuously testing these templates across platforms and making routine updates to the code. So if you have a responsive email template that you made, a year or 2 years ago, and you haven't tested it, we would definitely recommend continuing to test it on an ongoing basis, because the way that emails display in inboxes can change over time. The standards change over time. This video module is playable within the email itself, but on devices and platforms where that doesn't work, we've coded the content to be substituted with an animated GIF or a static fallback image with a click to play button where the video opens up in a new browser window. So sometimes by coding that type of stuff up front, rather than waiting until you want to put a video in the email, will make your email marketing process a lot smoother as well. And again, that way you're using the exact same code every time, and you've got your go-to, if you will, just to make sure that you're on the right path. In addition to continuously testing and updating templates, we also continuously run spam tests before each mailing through Litmus. Again, we hear a lot of folks who do this the first time and then don't test on an ongoing basis, and that's where you can fall short, because again, just you saw in the example with the Mother's Day email with Cuisinart, all of a sudden just one email that was sent out essentially tanked their deliverability. So you want to make sure that you're monitoring that on an ongoing basis. The spam tests are sent to real inboxes and basically show whether we're in the inbox or the junk folder. And this helps make sure our content isn't triggering junk and spam filters, and it also helps us monitor our sending domain reputation. So again, this is one of those areas that I feel like marketers tend to gloss over or forget about, but is extremely, extremely important and something that you can take a look at on an ongoing basis. So overall, implementing all these changes has resulted in increased engagement from Cuisinart's customers and more web traffic from the email channel. The open rate increased dramatically because we weren't sending to people who had no chance of opening anyway, whether that's because the email address was invalid or it was going into spam. But ultimately, by creating a more targeted send list, we, by default, essentially, we're having a higher open rate. And you can see the click-through rate increase as well with our template updates. Their template before was broken, essentially not rendering correctly. And in some cases, consumers can actually see that as spammy in itself. So if your email is broken, they're not going to be able to read it, or they're going to have a kind of a negative brand image, and they might say, oh, I'm not going to open these emails because they don't look good, and I can't read them anyway, so what's the point? So essentially, you want to make sure that you're considering that as well, because it does help with that engagement. Again, when someone clicks in your email, that's another kind of good credit building, if you will, opportunity to show those ISPs that that customer is engaged and you are a legitimate sender because that person is so engaged. So a couple of takeaways here, some deliverability tips that you'll want to make sure that you write down from here. Always send from authenticated domains and IPs that have been gradually warmed. If you're currently not sending from an authenticated domain, it's not too late. You can definitely still do that. And if you're sending an IP that has poor deliverability to begin with, consider using a new one or identifying some opportunities to, try and basically rewarm your current IP, basically applying the exact same principles as if you were using a new one. Make sure you're sending to valid, engaged contacts who have explicitly opted in to receive your emails. That is the best practice and ideal scenario. Obviously, a lot of people are in varying places with that. So make sure that you've, done your homework and that you know who those contacts are, so that even if you are going to be, slowly trying to re-engage contacts over time, that you know exactly who's who in your database, and you can make those strategic steps rather than blindly hoping that you'll have good deliverability by sending to those folks that you're not sure about. Make sure you're keeping contacts engaged by providing relevant content that is easy to interact with. Again, a lot of that is kind of tied to the email template, but template aside, just making sure that the content doesn't read as spammy, that you're not providing information that your customers aren't going to want to open or click into or engage with. Even if there's cases where your intent is that they just read maybe a newsletter in the email, always provide a call to action to read an additional article or download an asset or find an additional opportunity to engage them, even if you do just want them to read the email, again, because that will help to improve your sender score over time, and will basically add to that credit score, if you will. And continuously monitor those deliverability metrics. Again, you can either do this manually by sending this on an ongoing basis. Something that we have done for some of our customers is set up a deliverability dashboard where it will alert the customer if they've dipped below a certain point, or if there's certain pieces that they should look into, whether it's kind of on a database level or for an individual email send. But ultimately, whatever way that you approach continuous monitoring, we definitely recommend doing that at regular intervals. So stay tuned. We are going to be sending you an email deliverability checklist that's got a lot of the information from the presentation today, as well as the recording of this entire webinar that you can share with your team and revisit. We also want to provide the opportunity to help out. We know that it's a lot of investment essentially to look into deliverability. We are, for a limited time, providing a free mini marketing audit. You can choose from one of these three. The first one is a deliverability audit. So ultimately uncovering your deliverability issues and creating a high-level plan to get your email to the inbox. We'll do some very brief research kind of from that step one to help you understand where you're at currently and propose a plan to move forward. We also have an email design audit. So that one's focusing more on your email template. We'll review any major issues we see. Happy to focus a little bit more on the deliverability front, but even if your deliverability is great, that's a wonderful opportunity to just have someone take a second peek at your email template and get some recommendations on it. And then the final audit that we have is an email performance audit, where we'll take a look at your email campaign performance. That's kind of both one-off emails as well as continuous campaigns, or triggered messages, transactional messages. We'll recommend steps to increase engagement and conversions for those programs. So if you email sales@weareaware.com and reference the audit that you're interested in, we are allowing one per company now through the end of May. So if that's something that you're interested in, I definitely encourage you to reach out. I will essentially have someone from my team work with you directly to understand, what your challenges are. We can even help recommend the best audit based off of your current scenario. And hopefully that will help you you're on your way to achieving some of your marketing goals for 2019. So we're going to take a couple of questions. I've got my colleague Allison here who's going to review some of them. Let's see what we've got.
Okay, thank you, Faith, for getting through a ton of information in just 35 minutes. We're going to go ahead and take 5 or so questions. If we don't get to yours today, we will certainly follow up with you directly and make sure we answer all of them. So first, I have a question from Sarah. She wants to know how frequently should she monitor her deliverability score or her IP and domain health?
So I would definitely recommend, it really depends on how many emails you're sending as well. If you're only sending maybe 2 emails per month, I would recommend reviewing your deliverability score on a dashboard. I think that's probably the best case scenario if you do have a dashboard where you can just preview that and see where you're at. Beyond that, I think, doing an overall audit, if you will, and diving a little bit deeper, I think at a minimum, I would do that quarterly throughout the year. But again, on an individual email basis, it's pretty easy, especially if you're using a tool like Litmus to test and make sure that your template is rendering correctly. It's pretty easy to run that spam score really quick there just to make sure that you're not going to run into any issues. So, it can be as frequent as every email send, but ultimately, kind of on an overall basis, I would recommend reviewing that on a quarterly basis.
Okay, great. So these are 2 questions from Robin, but I think the one is pretty fast. What was the name of the tool to find the industry report rates?
So that is Return Path. If you Google Return Path Deliverability Benchmark Report, that is something that, again, they put out every year. You'll have to fill out a quick lead input form to get that report. But it is pretty helpful, again, to get those industry averages as well as, by country, I believe it has as well. So definitely review that. What was the second question?
Sorry, she also wants to know what the difference between a hard and soft bounce is.
Okay, so soft bounces and hard bounces are pretty similar, and your ESP will handle them differently. Sometimes there's an organization setting where you can review this of, if you want to allow soft bounces and hard bounces. Essentially, a soft bounce is the equivalent of, imagine you're sending an email and an email inbox might say, this is a legitimate email address, but maybe not right now. One of the common issues of that is someone receiving someone's out of office, or if someone's email inbox is full. So, they can't take any more messages, and so essentially the inbox is going to reject your email, but that is considered a soft bounce. So, a bounce in general is basically an email that's not delivered. The hard bounce is typically if the email address is illegitimate, so that it's just doesn't exist, or in some cases the ISP will have spam traps essentially, so they will repurpose old email addresses and use them as spam traps. So if people are sending to those email addresses, then it can, and the reason it's called a spam trap essentially is because it can be seen as, if you send to this email address, then your data is dirty essentially, and you don't know who you're sending to. So that can potentially get you flagged as a spam, which is another reason, again, you don't want to send to people that are 10 years old that you haven't talked to in a long time, because you want to verify that that person is actually real or not. There are services out there that, you can basically upload your email database and they'll tell you whether or not those people are real or not. But ultimately, those hard bounces are essentially like a hard block. Like you can't send here, this isn't a real thing ever. Again, a lot of ESPs will automatically process those hard bounces and send them to a master suppression list of sorts. Some ESPs have a different standard for soft bounces. Sometimes you can allow a couple of sends of a soft bounce before it becomes a hard bounce. Or you might say, if we get a soft bounce, we just don't want to email those people. So like I said, most ESPs have a way to monitor those. If you don't have a way to do that, you'll want to make sure that you are monitoring those bounces and suppressing them, in a couple of different ways. But again, a lot of the ESPs have an automated way to perform that. It's typically a setting.
Okay, great. So this question comes from Joseph, and I know it's one that we hear from clients all the time. We don't want to see our database size go down. Do we have to unsubscribe or remove unengaged emails?
So I covered this a little bit, but essentially, if you want to have those email addresses still in your database just because you want record of those contacts, or in this new digital era where everything is interconnected and maybe you are sending them SMS and they're responding to those, or maybe you're passing them information through for some type of cooking or customer segmentation in other ways. No, you don't necessarily have to remove them from your database or necessarily unsubscribe them either, but ultimately it's something that you'll, again, want to know who those people are and make sure that you're not sending to them. An unsubscribe is one way to kind of manually remove them and say, okay, I'm just not going to send to these people anymore. But instead of unsubscribing, you can simply add those people to a suppression list and have them maintained. They're still in your database, but they're ultimately also on the suppression list, so it automatically won't send them those emails. I will say as well, though, be cautious on this and then have a strategic approach to it, because if you have, in the case of Cuisinart, 2 million emails, and you're seeing that 1 million plus of them aren't engaged, haven't opened any emails ever, ultimately, when you go to create your send query, it might look like you're sending to 1.2 million people, but really you're only sending to 200,000 because you might be suppressing 1 million email addresses. So, if you do that, just understand that there's not complications, but ramifications, or you need to understand what your numbers are so that you can cognizantly say, okay, well, that's not really going to be 1.2 million, that's going to be 200,000. And these are proposed open rates, and you can kind of set your goals accordingly based off of that number rather than based off of that unrealistic or kind of inflated number based off of the people that you don't want to send to. Again, this is something that we see with customers a lot, especially in the case of your boss or the higher ups say, we just can't remove these people from our database. They have to stay there, but I strongly recommend putting them into a query or a contact list, or whatever your ESP calls it, to know who those folks are and be able to strategically exclude them from certain email sends. I think there's always a time and a place to try and re-engage those folks, but ultimately you should, I would definitely recommend removing them if you can. If you can't, at least know who they are so you can segment them out accordingly.
Okay, that's a good segue to our next question from Mike, and this will be our last question, but then we will, again, follow up with everyone directly. How long should a re-engagement campaign be?
That's a good question. I would definitely say it depends on how old your contacts are. So if, in this case, we had looked at 180 days and said, okay, if someone's communicated with us in the last 180 days, then they're considered an active customer. It really might depend on the industry or based off of your contact database size as well. Ultimately, though, I would recommend spending no longer than 90 days trying to re-engage a contact. The thought there is if you're sending me emails for 3 months in a row and I haven't opened any of those emails, there's a good chance I'm not going to open. Now, that being said, maybe you've got seasonality to your business where someone's only going to open your emails around Christmas time, let's say. In that particular case, it might make a lot of sense that they haven't opened any emails in the last 180 days, and you might not want to just, kind of make that hard line. So I kind of like to look at the same analogy as hard bounces and soft bounces. So kind of making your soft unengaged list and then your hard unengaged list, or in the example here where we gave 6 different tiers essentially to identify different layers of engagement, and maybe modifying the times for that re-engagement campaign based off of how recently someone's engaged. So if someone hasn't engaged in 180 days, but they have in the last 365 days, let's say, we might want to try and re-engage them for 90 days, and maybe it makes sense then in another 90 days to try and ping them 1 or 2 more times just to see if you know, the seasonality would encourage their engagement essentially. But in that particular case, you know, again, that can be very much case-by-case basis based off of the industry and based off of your individual database. So there's no silver bullet for the right amount of time, or really even the right amount of emails. I usually recommend sending more than one. You know, the likelihood, if you've been sending 20 emails a month to someone, the likelihood of them opening the 21st one might not really be true. Definitely when you're looking at a re-engagement campaign as well, make sure that you're providing your best, most relevant content. In the example that we used here, we were releasing a new website, which is an exciting thing. A lot of people like to click through and see the new website, so that's definitely helpful. You know, things like Black Friday or Cyber Monday, if you're in the e-commerce industry, can be very, very useful as well, because typically there's a little bit of a higher engagement there regarding the promotions that you're able to do during that time frame. But ultimately, make sure that you're using a really enticing subject line and really enticing content as well to get them to re-engage. And again, over time, if you run it for, you know, what you've identified as an appropriate amount of time, let's say that is 90 days, and someone's still not engaging, it's time to make those hard decisions. And I would definitely recommend making those decisions earlier on for your marketing campaign, so that when it comes time to make that hard decision, that you've already made it, already identified what you're going to do with the contacts when they don't engage.
All right, thank you, Faith, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Again, you'll receive an email within the next day or so that will have the webinar recording, and it will also have a link to our email deliverability checklist. If you're interested in any of our marketing audits, please reach out to sales@whereaware.com. And thanks again for your time. We hope you'll join us again for next month's WOW webinar. Have a great day.